All right, today on The Explainer, we are diving deep. We're going to take one of the biggest, most influential ideas in modern philosophy, and we're going to put it under the microscope. Because there's this really powerful critique that, well, it questions the whole thing from the ground up. So let's get into it.
So, let's start with a question. A big one. What if your identity, what if it isn't some fixed thing that you have inside you? You know, like some kind of inner core. What if it's actually more like an act, a performance that you're constantly putting on every single day without even knowing you're on stage? That right there is the huge idea we're unpacking today.
And the architect of this whole idea? That's Judith Butler. I mean, her work didn't just join the conversation about gender and power. It completely flipped the table. It has influenced, well, pretty much everything from super dense academic theory all the way to pop culture. Seriously, it's impossible to overstate just how massive her impact has been. Okay, so the key concept here, the big one, is performativity. And right off the bat, let's be clear, this isn't about being performative like an actor on a stage. It's a much deeper idea. It's the notion that your gender isn't something you are, it's something you do. Think about all the tiny, repeated things we do every day, the way we walk, talk, dress. Butler argues that these stylized acts, which society kind of scripts for us, build up over time. And they create this illusion that we have some natural inner gender identity. It's wild, right?
But you know how it goes, right? Every huge theory gets a huge critique. And this is where our detective for today's story comes in, a philosopher named Jeff Boucher. He looks at Butler's work and says, wait a minute. He argues that even though this theory is all about social forces, there's this persistent kernel, as he calls it, of individualism hiding inside. Basically, he's saying that the theory, when you get right down to it, keeps trying to solve huge social problems by focusing on what one person does. And that is the puzzle we're going to try and solve today.
So here's the game plan. We're going to follow Boucher's investigation, step by step, through 3 of Butler's most famous books. We'll see exactly how he builds his case over a decade and a half of her writing. First stop on our investigation, Butler's absolute bombshell of a book from 1990, Gender Trouble. This is ground zero for performativity, and it's also where Boucher claims to find the very first clue. So Butler's main argument here is, well, it's pretty mind-bending. She says there's no doer behind the deed. What does that mean? It means there's no essential you that exists before you start performing gender. The performance itself is what creates the idea of a performer. It's just a repetition of social rules with no one pulling the strings. The goal was to totally get rid of the idea of some separate individual self that exists outside of society. But this is where Boucher pulls out his magnifying glass. He finds this quote from Butler herself right there in the book. And he zeroes in on one word, intentional. An intentional act? A dramatic construction? For Boucher, this is a smoking gun. This language totally clashes with the whole no doer behind the deed thing. It makes it sound like there is an actor hiding in the wings making choices.
And there it is. That's the first major puzzle piece Boucher puts on the board. On the one hand, Butler's theory says there's no subject, no individual before the performance. But on the other hand, when she talks about how we can resist or mess with these norms, through things like drag or parody, her language suddenly sounds like there is a clever individual deciding to do things differently. That's the kernel of individualism Boucher is hunting for.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. The plot is about to thicken. We're now in 1997, with Butler's book Excitable Speech. Here, she takes her theory and applies it to something really concrete, hate speech. And this is where the abstract theoretical problem suddenly has very real-world consequences. So here's Butler's game plan for fighting back with words. She says, look, words aren't set in stone. A hurtful word like queer can be taken, it can be repeated in a totally new, powerful, positive way. And if you do that enough, you can actually drain it of its power to hurt. She calls this resignification. It's like linguistic jujitsu, using the power of your opponent's words against them. Boucher, though, hits pause on this. He says not so fast. He argues that the real power of a word doesn't come from the person speaking it, it comes from the institution behind them. Think about it. If you're playing baseball in your backyard and you yell, "You're out," Okay, whatever. But when a major league umpire in a uniform in a stadium yells, "You're out," that's it, game over. Why? Because he's got the entire institution of baseball backing him up. Boucher's point is that an individual trying to re-signify a word is like that person in the backyard. They just don't have the institutional muscle to really change the game.
So this whole section really boils down to one crucial question. Where does power actually live? In Butler's view, it seems to bubble up from the individual, from their clever, rebellious use of language. But for Boucher, that's a huge blind spot. He argues that by focusing so much on what one person can say or do, the theory lets the real power players, the massive social institutions that rig the game in the first place, off the hook.
And that brings us to the final act of our investigation. We're now in the mid-2000s, and Butler has a new book. Maybe in response to critiques like Boucher's, her work takes what's called an ethical turn. But Boucher argues that this final twist, well, it only proves his point.
So, in this 2005 book, Butler tries to ground her politics in a new way. She talks about ethics, about our deep responsibility to other people. The idea is to base everything on our relationship to others, not just on ourselves. And on the surface, that sounds like a perfect solution to the individualism problem, doesn't it?
But this is where Boucher delivers his final argument. He says, look closer. Even in this new ethical model, what is the social world? It's just a bunch of one-on-one encounters, me and you, one self and one other. It's still a world of individuals bumping into each other. And his big point is that all the massive, invisible structures, the economy, the state, the legal system, that actually shape how we bump into each other, they've completely vanished from the picture.
So we followed the trail across 15 years of work. What's the final verdict? Let's recap the evidence. Let's look at the complete case file.
When you lay it all out, you can really see the pattern Boucher's pointing to. First, in gender trouble, we have the hidden actor making intentional choices. Then, in excitable speech, we get a politics focused on what one person says, not what institutions do. And finally, in her ethical work, the whole of society gets shrunk down to these one-on-one interactions. For Boucher, the conclusion is clear. The focus keeps snapping back to the individual.
And this all leads to Boucher's big conclusion. He says that because Butler's theory is so laser-focused on the individual, it can't really explain the massive, material, structural forces that control our world. The takeaway, according to him, is that while this theory is absolutely brilliant for understanding personal identity, it might not be the right tool for the job if your goal is huge, society-wide structural change.
Which leaves us with a really tough but really important question. A question this whole debate hangs on. If we want to change the world, where do we focus? Do we change ourselves, hoping our individual acts of rebellion ripple outwards? Or do we have to go after the big guys, the institutions, the structures, the systems themselves? There's no easy answer here, but it's definitely a puzzle worth thinking about. Thanks for diving in with us on The Explainer.